Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 34th and final meeting of the Constitution Europe External Affairs and Culture Committee in 2025. Our first item in our agenda is to take concluding evidence on the transparency of intergovernmental activity and its implications for parliamentary scrutiny. And we are joined this morning by Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture, and Chris Mackey, Deputy Director, Constitution and UK Relations in the Scottish Government. I welcome you both to committee this morning. We're going to go straight to questions this morning, Cabinet Secretary. So I wonder if you could tell us how the UK's commitment to reset relationships has developed between the four governments in the United Kingdom and how that is impacting on parliamentary business here, including the LCM process, and what's your overall impression of the effectiveness of relations with the UK government?
Well, thank you very much, Convener, for the invitation to discuss this and later matters. I think there definitely has been a change since the last UK general election, certainly rhetorically, where UK government ministers immediately after the election and for some time were very, very keen to stress their understanding of how suboptimal the predecessor UK government had approached intergovernmental relations, how that was not sustainable and there needed to be a change, and that they were committed to doing so. And at the start, that required little more often than meeting, because it was previously the case that across a wide range of subjects, meetings often never took place or were cancelled, or documentation wasn't provided for them, and then the contents of meetings when they were held were it wasn't working. And this was not just the view of the Scottish Government, it was the view of the Welsh Government and Northern Irish colleagues as well. So incoming UK government stressed that they understood that this was the context of intergovernmental relations and that they wanted to change it. And that led to a flurry of introductory meetings, which I took part in with the Secretary of State for Scotland, with ministers in the Cabinet Office and the Foreign Office, from memory, in terms of my policy areas. And all of them said the same thing. We want a reset in relations with the devolved administrations and want a reset with the European Union, and that the UK government was committed to doing both. And then after the initial meetings, we began to see a pickup in the meetings of the different formats of intergovernmental relations. So I'm sure the committee are aware of this, that the IGR structures include a format where the Prime Minister and devolved heads of government meet. Under the previous government, it was more often than not the case that the UK Prime Minister didn't attend at all. But the incoming government, the incoming Prime Minister was attending and has continued to attend, and these meetings have been held with regularity with devolved heads of government. There are interministerial standing committees, there are finance interministerial standing committee, and there are portfolio-specific interministerial groups. And all of these have been meeting, some of them beginning to meet for the first time, and that is a significant improvement. So that's step one, rhetorical acknowledgement that things were not working well, commitment to making them work better. First part of that commitment is one should be meeting. And then there are a broad range of how well is that working, and perhaps we're going to come on to that as well. And I would acknowledge that there are areas where there is good and improving dialogue, so probably the government minister that I speak most often with is Nick Thomas-Symonds of the Cabinet Office, who has responsibility for negotiations with the European Union. He's been the lead UK government minister dealing with the UK-EU agreement. But I have met with the Secretary of State for Scotland, the last Secretary of State for Scotland, and in his now new role at the Department for Culture, Media and Sport. And I met not long ago with Michael Shanks, who's one of the UK energy ministers. I'll stop there because no doubt you'll want to get on to how do these meetings and processes work, because I can perhaps share some insights on that as well.
So I think one of the areas that's come up repeatedly at the committee is the Internal Market Act. We've done a lot of work on that. And we see some of the Labour members in the Welsh Assembly now raising queries about the Internal Market Act. Do you think that the views of this Parliament are reflected in any progress that's been made in negotiating around that area?
No, I don't, because the UK government, which was elected having previously said that they would repeal the Internal Market Act, took up office and did not act on their previous commitment to repeal the Internal Market Act, overlooked 2 votes in this Parliament for the repeal of the Internal Market Act, which is the same position as the Welsh Labour government, which is that the issue is not about making the Internal Market Act work, it is about repealing it and making the Common Frameworks mechanism, which precedes the IMA, which is the Trojan horse in the devolved settlement. We have seen, since the new UK government took office, them reviewing the Internal Market Act. I think the formulation that they use is their preference to, quotes, foreground the common frameworks. So I think that's them saying they would, as a matter of course, prefer to deal with these intergovernmental matters through the common frameworks route, but that they want to keep the Internal Market Act in reserve. And that's been resisted very strongly from the Scottish Government, that still believes that the IMA should be repealed. And as you've drawn attention to, Convener, in a letter sent earlier this month by a significant number of Labour members of the Welsh Senedd, that they take the same view as we do, and they go in some detail. I'm sure the committee's seen the correspondence where they criticise the UK government's continuing involvement in areas of devolved responsibility, and saying that is not what they should be doing. So I've always taken the view, as I've given evidence to the committee, that where there's a willingness to make common frameworks operate, they can, and they should. And the Internal Market Act is a Trojan horse in the devolved settlement. It was a political project, and it was there to undermine devolved governments and administrations, and sadly it's been continued by the newer UK government.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We're going to move to questions from the committee. Mr Kerr. Thanks.
So, was it me?
Yeah,
oh, okay.
Stephen, sorry.
In terms of the reset, Cabinet Secretary, you mentioned a change of tone in rhetoric in terms of public comment. But you also mentioned meetings. I mean, the statistics, the facts would seem to suggest that since the reset, since the formalisation of IGR structures post-22, that the number of meetings actually has been pretty consistent between the formal meetings I'm talking about. So, according to the briefing we received, there were 25 meetings from July 24 to July 25, the first year of the new Labour government. There were 23 meetings from January to December 22, but 35 January to December 23, which showed that from the initial inception of the formal IGR structures, there had been an increase. Now, you mentioned meetings with the Prime Minister. according to the data, the number of formal meetings that the current Prime Minister's had with First Ministers is about the same as Rishi Sunak had for the 2 years previous to his, during the time he was Prime Minister. So what has actually changed?
The first thing is, I think, particularly on the portfolio-specific interministerial groups, which is where a lot of the real work takes place, I think that we now have the formation of these right across Whitehall departments, as in meetings have taken place for all of them. And I don't think that was the case previously. I think there were some government departments where there hadn't even been meetings at all. And so, I think that's to be welcomed, because I think a mechanism's been agreed. This is how we could be meeting, how we should be meeting, and that's up and running. To be honest, I'm more focused on what goes on in the meetings,
right,
and the ongoing nature of common challenges, trying to find solutions, trying to help one another understand where one's coming from. And that matters to the government in terms of the government's priorities, obviously matters to yourselves as parliamentarians who are wanting to scrutinise that process. So in advance of coming here, I thought, well, how can I best illustrate how some of this works? Because there is a tension between wanting to have maximum transparency, but also in intergovernmental relations, and this is the norm domestically and internationally, one has to be able to protect a space to be able to have ongoing discussions about how negotiations, for example, are progressing. So I thought, well, maybe I might briefly, with your indulgence, convener, talk you through how that has worked in relation to the UK-EU agreement. And I think the committee understands that much of that agreement takes place in a devolved space. So much that we have now learned about what the UK government has agreed to on a headline level is in a devolved space, and now we are seeing the beginnings of outcomes, again, often in the devolved space. So it's important that devolved administrations are part of that process, both to formulate the negotiating position, be part of an ongoing understanding of how things are going, and then to learn where these things have got to. And I think it's a mixed picture, is what I would want to share with you. So there was an initial meeting with myself, Nick Thomas-Symonds, and from memory, I think also colleagues from other devolved administrations, or perhaps that happened at a separate time. Anyway, he was very keen to share with the Scottish Government, the UK Government's hopes of a UK-EU agreement, and I shared our perspectives. There were a number of areas where there were shared priorities, wanting to get back into Erasmus, wanting to secure an agri-food deal, wanting to restore freedom of movement for younger people. I raised the issue of Creative Europe as being an area of priority for the Scottish Government. And then, of course, there's the standing item of importance in Scotland, obviously, around fishing. So that was an introductory meeting where I shared what the Scottish Government's position was. But I said that it was going to be important for us through the process, because it would be a matter of negotiation, that we should be updated on how this was proceeding. And Nick Thomas-Symonds took that to heart, and we met again in Edinburgh. We were joined by the Welsh Government minister who came to Edinburgh. We were joined by the First Minister and Deputy First Minister in Northern Ireland online. And we went through an update of how things had been going. And it was pretty high level. There wasn't a lot of detail. And in that meeting, I asked why it was that the other side in the negotiation, so Maros Šefčovič, negotiating on behalf of the Commission, had a negotiating mandate agreed with the member states of the European Union and a mechanism for updating them. So they actually had the paperwork. And I said, can we have the same as they do? Because if it works for them and it is a good thing for them, why would it not be for us? And he said that he thought that was an interesting suggestion and that he would take that away. And then we got to the end of his update on things, and I asked him why there had been no update on fisheries, because at that stage we were able to read about it in the newspapers. And he gave a high-level answer about the UK government's wish for long-term stability for fisheries, but that he wasn't in a position to go into the details of what might emerge from the negotiations. Now, from memory, that meeting took place towards the end of the week which preceded the agreement. So it took place only a few number of days, a weekend, before the agreement was reached. Now, I know, and most people who've been around the block in politics understand that, in particular in a European context, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And I acknowledge that that is a challenge for the UK government in wanting to make sure that it can go through the negotiating process and reach the best deal possible. But our European colleagues are fully apprised of the situation on an ongoing basis. The next that we heard about this was the agreement. There had been no paperwork shared, although it had been asked for and a commitment had been given to consider sharing it. And we learned, amongst other things, that there had been agreement on fisheries. There are a number of members of the committee I know who raised that at the time, and were very unhappy about that. And at the same time, we also learned that the UK government had not included accession to Creative Europe as part of the negotiating processes. Now, there's a number of things to take away from that. One, firstly, there was a process of engagement, so that is right and proper. But I don't think it is as good as it can be. And I think also it makes me think about how do we share information about that with the likes of yourselves or other subject committees of the Scottish Parliament, for example, fisheries colleagues and agricultural questions, so that there's an awareness of things that have been raised, direction of travel, and being able to hold people to account. Scottish Government ministers, have we raised things? Did we ask for things to be considered as a priority? And then to understand from the UK Government what was possible, what was not possible. So there's an insight, Mr Kerr, sorry, but I wanted to give a real sort of detailed insight into how some of this works. And then, just as a follow-up, we had this week, I had a phone call with Nick Thomond-Simmons the morning of the announcement around Erasmus+, which was pretty fully reported in the Times newspaper, I think. So
before he phoned
before he phoned me, yes. And I think I'm right in saying the call was less than 10 minutes. And I asked what I imagine most of you would have wanted to know in relation to Erasmus+, which is how will this work given Scotland's different funding structure in universities? And Mr Thomond-Simmons didn't know and undertook to get back to me. So, again, interaction, good. Probably better that we can do that before it's in the newspapers. And where there are things that are, self-evidently, obviously, of devolved interest, responsibility, Scotland's funding structure for universities and students and so on is not a secret. So, I'm somewhat surprised would be the diplomatic way of putting that we couldn't get an answer at that stage on things. But tone constructive, wanting to be in touch. It is a common priority. Scottish Government and the UK Government both want accession to Erasmus+. So no criticism of that. Still need to understand some of the details of that. So there's a little bit of colour into how all of this works. But I'm also putting it on the table because I think it will lend itself to consideration of how can we government report to you about these meetings in these different formats, how can we do them in a way that is content-rich, but in a way that does not undermine our ability to have intergovernmental discussions? Because, as I've already said, international, both domestic and international custom and practice around these meetings is that they are private, but at the same time we have to get the balance right so that we can be held to account for what does or does not take place as part of these processes.
So, from what you've just said, the Scottish Government knew that fisheries were part of the negotiating set of cards the UK Government was playing with the EU, yeah?
The only thing that was confirmed was the UK Government's position, which was that they were in favour of long-term, and this is from memory, Mr. Kerr, is Mr. Thomas Simpson saying to me, after I prompted him, not that he volunteered it, I prompted him to ask what the position was about negotiations. It had been in the newspapers. What was the UK Government's position? He said that the UK Government's position was that it favoured long-term stability for fisheries, which gave no insight into what that might mean.
Yeah, and you knew nothing about the 2038
No.
deal, which was struck apparently on the morning.
No.
Yeah, and on Erasmus, the cost of Erasmus has never been discussed either. Whether Scotland's going to bear some of the reported £8 billion it's going to cost for the UK to be part of Erasmus, that's never been discussed.
No.
And as you rightly say, there is a different formula, different business model for the universities up
Indeed.
here. None of that's been considered. So what I'm really interested in is, talking about a reset is fine, you know, because I know that's politics, and a lot of politics is window dressing. And so there's been a lot of good window dressing about the reset. But what I consider, I don't think very much in practical terms has changed. And so what I'm really interested to hear you talk about, having read the submission that you've made to the committee as part of our inquiry, is exactly how better it can be made to work. Because at the end of the day, as you well know, Angus Robertson, I am a unionist. I want the union to work optimally. Currently, I don't think it does. I don't think that could possibly be stated. So there has to be a better way of doing this. Now, you're at the front end, you're a minister. Your viewpoint on all this is of particular interest to the committee because you are a Scottish minister. That adds to the interest level, of course. So you're familiar with the work of Andrew Dunlop and the review of intergovernmental relationships that was undertaken, commissioned by Theresa May, continued by Boris Johnson, and finally published by the Johnson government, which led to the formalisation of the IGR structures and meetings that we have now. So that was a real reset in the sense that something emerged that hadn't emerged previously. So what aspects of Dunlop do you feel have not been adequately addressed? Where is, because I'd be interested to hear what your view is on Dunlop's work. I'm a bit of an enthusiast for what he had to say because it seemed to be most pragmatic and functional in the way that he addressed the problematic relationships that undoubtedly were between the UK government and the devolved administrations. So I'm interested to know what your take is on Dunlop and where the implementation has not been delivered and how delivering it in full might actually create a genuine, an actual reset in the way that the governments, the United Kingdom government and the devolved administrations work together.
Sure. So I'll share a first observation on Dunlop, and then I'll ask Chris Mackie to come in with your permission, convener. The thing that I find most interesting around Dunlop relates to funding. And I note that the UK government didn't follow the Dunlop recommendations on arrangements for spending in devolved areas. The Dunlop Review recommended that there should be agreement between the UK government's departments and relevant devolved governments on any funding bid to encourage cross-border collaboration or working. Doesn't happen. In fact, it's the opposite of what is currently being pursued on local growth funding. And we may come back to this, Convener, because curiously, the current UK government is taking a different approach in Wales to that which it is in Scotland. And we might wonder why. But nonetheless, Mr Kerr asked me a question around Dunlop. So that's one of the most interesting points.
What about the structure that you suggest?
Well, I mean, he talks about a number, there should be a senior cabinet position with responsibility for constitutional-related matters. In practice, that's happened under the last UK government. Michael Gove was
But not the creation of an Office of State.
Pardon me?
But not the creation of a new Office of State.
Okay, well, I mean, it's the organisation the UK government is for the UK government.
Yeah, but what's your view?
I would say. Well, I mean, my view is I think it is a good thing that there are senior members of government that have a responsibility for intergovernmental relations and that there is a clear locus. Although, having said that, I do think it's really important for the heads of government to understand that this is a matter of importance to them and not just something which is then palmed off to somebody who's thought to have the political smarts to deal with Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And the other Dunlop recommendations included a new cabinet subcommittee on cross-government strategic priorities.
An independent secretariat.
Yeah, and well, so I mean, the first thing I would say about that is, I mean, there is a secretariat. It sits within the Cabinet Office. It includes, amongst others, a seconded civil servant that works for the Scottish Government. So there is currently a secretariat. And from my understanding, again, and Mr Mackey will speak for himself as a senior civil servant in a second on this, I think what has been reported back to me is that those arrangements, the ability to schedule intergovernmental meetings, provide the necessary background information to make the logistical arrangements for all. I don't think there are any concerns about that working in practice as a secretariat, and it does exist.
But it's not independent. It's part of the Cabinet Office. Well,
like I said, it involves not just civil servants operating to the UK government, it also involves civil servants who work to the Scottish Government. So they are not independent of government, of course not, because this is intergovernmental relations. But I think from a Scottish Government point of view, our view is that it operates. It operates. So
this is important. The Scottish Government's view is that you're kind of agnostic about having an independent secretariat.
No, we're saying there is a secretariat and we are content with its functioning. But I'll hand over to Mr Mackey to...
OK, I'm quite surprised to hear that, frankly, given the evidence we've received as a committee. I would have thought the Scottish Government would want to have an independent secretariat.
Thanks, Mr Kerr. Thanks, Convener. Just on 2 points. In terms of the Dunlop Review, I think it's important to just clarify that the new structures flowed out of the jointly commissioned review that reported in 2022. That was a Four Nations review. The Dunlop Review was not a Four Nations commission, but obviously there was due regard.
A precursor.
Yeah, there was due regard to that. On the the Secretariat, I think we would acknowledge that the Secretariat is not a full independent Secretariat that is housed in a different building and with different with a seal around it that you might expect, for example, for a public inquiry. However, the Secretariat does act independently, even though it is housed for convenience in the Cabinet Office. We have a great deal of confidence in the Secretariat acting impartially across the different...
So can you call a meeting of these IGRs?
The Scottish Government has
IGR meetings. You can call a meeting.
Well, there is equal. It obviously relies on each of the other governments agreeing to it, but it is not led by the UK government. It is a rotational meeting focused for the various.
And it's ad hoc.
And it's ad hoc.
Yeah. There's no structure. There's no schedule of meetings. I mean, it's not like the Council of Ministers in the European Union.
Well, there is a presumption written into the IGR review about the regularity with which the meetings should
But they're
take
not
place.
held that way, are they? I mean, we've got data here that shows that some of these meetings are pretty regular, as in maybe once every 4 months. Some of them once a year. Some of them not at all. The advantage of an independent secretariat is it creates, in the same way that, and I would have thought you would be in favour of this actually, in the same way that you get with the Councils of Ministers in the European Union, you get a regularity, an independent setting, an independent agenda, all of that stuff that currently you don't have as the Scottish Government.
So I understand the point that Mr Kerr is making, and I'm very sympathetic to the aims that he's sharing with the committee about wanting to make sure that intergovernmental structures operate as regularly as necessary, that they are not subject to either a lack of agreement for them to take place and or cancellation that makes an ongoing professional, successful working relationship operate. And I would concur with him that it is a work in progress. In acknowledging that there is a secretariat and that it does involve Scottish Government civil servants as well as civil servants acting to the UK Government, I actually think that if there is improvement to be made, it is not because of the nature of the secretarial agreements. It is the willingness of the UK Government and or individual departments to take part in meetings. That is the bottom line. So we can come back to some other examples that you might wish me to share with the committee about the nature of discussions with different government departments, because with some it would appear to work very well, but with others it would not. And the way that has been broached is that the Cabinet Office has said that they are very keen to hear where other UK government departments are not meeting, are not prepared to meet, will not schedule meetings. So it's not, the Secretariat is not an impediment to all of this.
But
it is the willingness of UK government departments.
But it could be a catalyst to create exactly what, because that is,
Mr. Kerr, I would keep an open mind on that, because I think it should be in everybody's interests to make these processes work as well as they can. All I'm sharing with Mr. Kerr and the committee is the perspective both of Scottish Government ministers and also civil service colleagues who are part of these processes on a day-to-day basis, which is this is not thought to be where any shortcomings may lie in how we make the IGR process work as well as it can do.
And of course I accept that the structure, is not the be-all and end-all of this, because it's outcomes that we're interested in.
Indeed.
But I just think, I'm putting to you, that from a Scottish Government point of view, it would be useful if there was an independent heartbeat to the process, rather than it being so ad hoc. I mean, ad hocery, I know, is the British way of doing things, but sometimes that creates spaces and gaps that create their own issues. And that's why I've fixated, as it were, this morning on the need for an independent secretariat that has the shared authority of the UK Government and the devolved administrations to make all of this happen, because currently we don't have the transparency, we don't have agendas, we don't have minutes, we don't have communiques, and there needs to be some mechanism, independent of these governments, that creates that transparency and accountability that currently doesn't exist for us as parliamentarians.
So, can I just firstly reinforce the point? I'm very open-minded to the points that Mr. Kerr is saying, given the outcomes that he's wanting to achieve. Point one. Point two, just to give a little bit more colour into how everything works. I wouldn't want to give the impression that the Secretariat is the only route through which intergovernmental relations operate.
Sure.
more often than not, it will involve a direct ask between the different directorates of the Scottish Government with their vis-à-vis UK Government departments to secure a meeting, a bilateral meeting, more often than not. And that is where, as I've already shared with the committee, that can work and sometimes it doesn't work. So I just, for the committee's benefit, some background on that so that one is aware of how challenging this can be sometimes. So we obviously have a new Secretary of State for Scotland, who, for the avoidance of doubt, I have known for a long time and is somebody who I get on with well personally. And as one might expect, on assuming office, an introductory meeting was requested on the 10th of September. A reply was received on the 23rd of September, offering a meeting on the 13th of October. On the 24th of September, the meeting was agreed for the 15th of October. On the 7th of October, the UK Government postponed and suggested the 11th of November, which was then agreed. But on the 10th of November, the UK Government postponed initially to later on the 11th and then to the quotes, the future. And we then went on to ask for potential future dates and have received no response to date. That's one example. A second example in my area of responsibility, covered by a concordat between the Scottish Government and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which includes a provision for annual meetings between the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs and the Foreign Secretary, just by way of important context and background. In terms of the new Foreign Secretary, again, Yvette Cooper, somebody I've known for a long time, hold in very high personal regard. 3 approaches have been made for an introductory meeting and no response has been received. After the 3rd attempt, there was an unsolicited ask from the FCDO for an introductory call with me from a junior minister. Now, I would put that on the not really working well end of the scale. And if Mr Kerr is suggesting that there might be a way for a secretariat to have some locus in the bilateral arrangements to try and make things work, as I say to the committee, I have an open mind on that and I will take that away because I'm sure some of this will probably come as news to UK Government ministerial colleagues. I mean, we're all very busy people, I get that, and things are cancelled and it's, you know, and it's not always easy to reschedule, I get all of that. But I think, well, some of this probably comes as news to some UK Government ministers.
Sure it does.
And taken in the round, I think it really should concern them that when one looks at the sum total of how suboptimal a lot of this continues to be after a rhetorical reset, which I've acknowledged, that surely this meeting schedule, securing bilateral meetings, ensuring that interministerial groups are meeting when important things are ongoing, because there are other processes that are underway at the moment that really impact on us. And we are learning as a government often about things that are agreed on our behalf in devolved areas. A recent example is trade talks with the United States with important provisions around pharmaceuticals. Mr Kerr, of course, knows that we have a different approach to the providing of medication in Scotland to the rest of the United Kingdom, to the public. So again, you would have thought that a UK government would involve devolved administrations as part of these considerations, and the first the Scottish Government learnt about it was with the publication of the agreement.
But that's exactly why, I'm afraid, and I know it's boring probably to anyone that's watching this committee's proceedings, but that's why architecture, structure, processes are actually critical underpinnings to this flow of communication. And, you know, I actually, surprise, surprise, perhaps for Angus Robertson, I have very sympathy for the couple of stories he's told about the lack of availability to have meetings. And I'm sure he's right when he says that UK ministers probably, that will be news probably to both of the ministers that you've identified. But it does it does suggest to me that something is inadequate with the current structure and process. And I think I've taken more than my fair share of time, so I'll pass back to the convener.
I think Mr Bibby had a supplementary on this area.
Yeah, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary.
Morning.
Mr Kerr cited the number of meetings, I think, from the UK Government's response to the committee, around 25 inter-ministerial standing committee meetings and inter-ministerial group meetings over since the new government was elected at the UK level. You mentioned earlier that there's obviously other meetings that happen out with that, bilateral meetings and requests made. You mentioned that there was two examples of cases where meetings have not yet been arranged. Out with those 25 meetings, how many other bilateral meetings have taken place between Scottish Government ministers and UK Government?
So I think I can only answer that question in relation to myself, Mr Bibby, but I'll be happy to update the committee more generally. I've been provided with confirmation that I've met with UK Government ministers on at least 24 occasions since the change in UK Government. So it'll be a significant number.
Okay. So who, in terms of, is it your responsibility to gather that data across the government in terms of that having a handle on how many meetings there have been between UK Government ministers and Scottish Government ministers?
I think actually it's the Deputy First Minister has governmental responsibility for intergovernmental relations.
Yeah. I
have responsibility for constitution. And in terms of who would keep these kind of details, that would be my civil service colleagues would keep a note of all of that. And then it would also be, I think, fair to acknowledge that there will be some UK Government ministers who, because of their area of responsibility, so Europe being a good example of that, Nick Thomas-Symonds, I think, is very committed to meeting with regularity. Mm-hmm. I think it's probably also the case, I would observe that more often than not, I tend to be meeting with Scottish and Welsh UK Government ministers. And maybe it's also the case that they have a better sense that one should actually be meeting about things than some others. That's just a perception that I have. Yeah. So, sorry, I'll keep my answer brief. I don't have the full number, Mr Bibby. If the committee would wish us to try and make the best stab at a global number, I'm happy for
I think
to provide that number.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, I think that would. Yeah, that would.
Just so there is no. We can certainly take that away. There is no centrally held list of UK and Scottish Government meetings other than it being included in the normal run of transparency data that's published on a regular basis about ministerial meetings. So those meetings will be included in that regularised publication, which is published in arrears.
Yeah, I think that information would be helpful because we're talking about perceptions there. It'd actually be good to get the full information on what ministers are met when and actually have that across different departments.
Thank you. Mr Brown.
Yeah, thanks very much. The committees, I think most of the committee went to London to hear evidence from a number of sources. My take on it, and maybe not exactly the same as other committee members, is that it's an absolute shambles. Ad hocery, I think I'd mentioned it down there, characterises all the different structures, the Tier 1 meetings that never happen the same day as whatever the other meeting's called, the extent to which meetings are held at and only at the behest of the UK Government when it decides it wants to do it, the fact there's no independent secretariat in many cases. It is all completely ad hoc, but I disagree. I agree with much of what Stephen Kerr said. I do disagree that we'll find the answer to this in new structures, because it's not the structures, to my mind, that are underpinning this complete failure. I know the UK is quite a unique state in being a unitary state. It's not a confederation, it's not a federation, but it's completely unable to manage the process of devolution. And I've said, I'm not a unionist, but if I was, I would want this to work. You would think everyone would want this to work. It seems to me, and I'd be interested in the Cabinet Secretary's view on this, that it's really underpinned by an attitude which is really contempt for the devolved settlements, an imperious kind of approach as to power sharing. There's no co-ownership of the structures or the processes. There is no agreement on this at the start. It's just decided at the whim of the government of the day. And that is not every other country that you care to examine, Belgium or Germany or France, have a different and more sustainable approach to it. So until the attitude changes, there's not this fear or contempt for the devolved administrations. And it varies, of course, depending on which party's in power. So the attitude towards Wales, I should mention, I think, in relation to Pride and Place, this asymmetric approach where it's a different party in power. It's just, in my view, an absolute shambles. And it will not be properly addressed until there's a, what is it the Europeans call it, a co-produced or an agreed process and structures where everyone's involved and everyone takes ownership. That's not what happens just now. And my view is it's not going to change until that happens, but I'd be interested in the Cabinet Secretary's view.
I hear Mr Brown using the word shambles, and I think I've used the word suboptimal, and I'm not sure they're that far apart often. And I agree very much with him that this is not primarily about structures, and notwithstanding the fact that I think one should keep an open mind as to how structures might work, and that's fine. The key underlying issue is the attitude towards things. And I agree with that. I think the expression that he was looking for from a European context was co-decision, the co-decision process that's involved between European institutions. And that's certainly not the case in intergovernmental relations. What I have said, and I think I've said this to this committee before, is I think we have come to the end of the rhetoric about reset having any validity anymore, because now we are down to the actual content and the quality of intergovernmental relations. And I have no doubt that the attitude in Westminster is that devolved administrations and parliaments are subordinate, and that one should do as much as is necessary to help intergovernmental relations work where it's in one's interest and to ignore it where it isn't. And that is the reality of things. And Mr Brown drew international comparisons, and I have discussed this with colleagues in other European countries which have federal, quasi-federal, devolved structures, and they are aghast about how it works in the UK. I mean, ad hoc sounds like a kind of formal way of describing things, but it has most certainly been suboptimal. And regardless of whether one is for or against Scottish independence, or for those who would wish a more federal situation, which is what a previous UK Prime Minister suggested we would be having after 2014, we are very, very far away from that. Can we try and get some of this to work better? Yes, I'm trying, and other colleagues are. And it actually, a lot of it would not be that difficult. I mean, take the European stuff, for example. And I reflect on my earlier point about there has to be trust between governments in an intergovernmental structure. That's a very important element to how all of this can work. But unless one tries it, it's never going to get better. And in fact, in a European context, it's going backwards. Because Mr Brown could have reminded the committee that, of course, in the past, there were Scottish Government civil servants who took part in the annual fisheries negotiations in Brussels, in the room. They were there. And now that is not the case. and we are just getting a readout of this is what has been agreed, without any ongoing discussion about what has been considered. So that's actually going back on pre-devolution custom and practice, and it's worse.
I suppose the question is, and I don't disagree at all with what's been said, I think, to my mind, in my experience, the kind of best period for intergovernmental relations was during the Cameron years, because, and it wasn't a structure, it was an ethos of what they called the respect agenda, which seemed to work to a large extent. And, you know, all the stuff about trust and respecting confidences, there's never been a recorded instance of any Scottish Government minister of any stripe betraying or disclosing, whether it was market-sensitive information or political information. You would think that would be enough to get some trust, even if the fundamental constitutional aims of the two governments are so different. The question really is, how are we going to get there? Right? What's going to, because is it going to take an election again before there's a genuine attempt to try and address this, or is it just going to perpetuate itself?
Well, I mean, I think it is impossible to operate in a multinational state where 85% of the population lives in one constituent part, and the government of the United Kingdom operates both as, in effect, an English and a UK government, and sometimes does not understand the difference between the two. That is the difference between the United Kingdom and all other federal or confederal systems I'm aware of. I'm not aware of a federal or confederal system that has a working system that has sustained a state with that divergence in size, which also brings with it a divergent view on which is the most important part. And that is why I believe that Scotland's optimal form of governance is as an independent country like every other country of a similar size that's a member state of the European Union. That is the best way to do things. And then, for example, if as an EU member state, negotiations were being undertaken on our behalf, as is the case in the EU on trade, for example, that individual member states are part of the process that draws up the negotiating position, not the same in the United Kingdom, are kept fully apprised of the situation with regular meetings of their permanent representatives in Brussels as the process is ongoing. The documentation is shared, not just with them, but with the member states in their capitals, and then agreement is reached involving the member state. That is not what happens in the UK. Now, for people of a unionist persuasion who have said that they would wish the UK structures to work, I think this poses a big challenge, because we can see that there is better custom and practice elsewhere. We can see that that doesn't operate in the UK, and I think Mr. Brown is right. Where and what is going to bring about an attitudinal change? Because that is what is required. And I'm not seeing that, and I think with the passing of time and the rhetoric of reset being well and truly in the rearview mirror, people like yourselves in this committee and others in this place are going to be, and perhaps members of the Westminster Parliament are going to be asking ever more difficult questions about these processes.
Well, just to say, that was evident actually in the visit to London, because there are members, I forget the name of the committee that we joined for a meeting. I mean, the big casualty in all this for us is the lack of transparency at a parliamentary level of what's going on between the governments. And I understand the difficulties the Scottish Government will have because it won't be in control of much of this, but the bottom line is the punter's not got a chance of finding its way through all the conventions, the ad hocery and all the rest of it, usually wrapped in confidentiality as well. So from a punter's point of view, there is no real transparency. They can't see where the governments are actually working together or not, or where, if necessary, to apportion accountability or blame for it. We did discuss, I think, a little bit down in London, the prospects for maybe a joint committee of the two parliaments. even one which somebody even resurrected the old Scottish Grand Committee, which would not be practical at all. But there was a bit of exploration of different methods by which we could try to increase transparency, one of which included all the devolved administrations and parliamentarians and those from Westminster. Is that the kind of initiative which I don't think it will lead to the breakthrough that we should want to see? Is that the kind of thing that the Scottish Government would support?
So, on the transparency point, I am very, very sympathetic, as I have shared with the committee before, on wanting to make sure that you have enough information to do your work of holding this government to account, but also by extension, and in this context, being able to understand how the intergovernmental processes work. And what we discussed just a moment ago about the fact that the Scottish Government does publish information about interministerial meetings. It exists. It is public. It is perhaps not published in a format that lends itself to being able to see where are things not happening, an obvious area that you would wish to pursue. And as I've said before on European Union alignment, that I am very keen for us to provide you with the information so that you are able to interrogate what is the Scottish Government doing around European Union alignment. I will take away that point, both in terms of our own processes, but would want to give the committee an assurance that I'm very keen to also discuss this with Welsh and Northern Irish colleagues, because what's true for here is true for there. Now, maybe there are processes in Wales and Northern Ireland that we don't undertake. I would want to know what those are. But maybe there are just very self-evident approaches that we might take that would help better inform colleagues in the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Senate and Northern Irish Assembly in this respect. It will only make a difference, I think, on the margins. I agree with Mr Brown on that. But I think having transparency in this area is going to make it ever more difficult for people to not do what they're supposed to do. I mean, the Foreign Office is an absolutely classic example of how it has not worked for me, because one only needs to look at how long I've been in office and then ask how many times I have held an annual meeting with the Foreign Secretary, not a junior minister, the Foreign Secretary, and that will tell you that concordats or intergovernmental agreements and structures and processes are not working as they have been set out to operate.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, Mr Brown used the word contempt there, which sounds a sort of active verb to use. Is ambivalent closer to the mark? Because what we also heard in London was that basically the devolved nations weren't on the radar of some of the Whitehall departments.
So I'm coming increasingly to the view that for most it is the total absence of any conscious consideration whatsoever of how office holding in the UK government actually requires one to deal with devolved administrations. And that is as true in areas of devolved as they are reserved areas of responsibility, because the example I gave a moment ago to Mr Kerr around trade negotiations, making agreements around pharmaceuticals and how that impacts on Scotland, where we have free prescriptions, is an obvious area where one needs to be a part of the processes. So I am of the view that it's less of an active decision and it's more one of just not taking it seriously at all and having a mindset that just is absolutely thoughtless about this. But it then goes back to how can one be so, and my observation about the UK being unique as a multinational state in having 85% of the population in one part and operating as an English and UK government at the same time. So, and will that ever change? No, I don't think so.
Thank you. Mr Holker-Johnson, Mr Bibby have indicated they want to come in. Is this on this area or is it a new area?
Well, some of it kind of fits into it.
Oh, can I bring in Mr Harvey, who's been waiting a while? I want to bring you both back in then. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. You've talked a bit both about the improvements that have happened and about the inadequacy of where we've still got to. I think what you described as a suboptimal shambles, combining your words and Keith Brown's words. Just to think for a moment, though, about the extent to which improvement has happened. Am I right in thinking that there is nothing that has in any way locked that in? I mean, even devolution can't be fundamentally locked in, but it's solid to the extent that an incoming UK government that wanted to reverse it would find it technically and legally and politically difficult to abolish devolution. Not impossible, but very difficult. Is there anything that has happened that would make it difficult for an incoming UK government to go back to the hostility that we saw before?
So the simple answer is no. But I would also pray and aid the continuance of the Internal Market Act on the statute book as being an example of a pre-election acknowledgement that there was an attempt to subvert the devolution process, and then on attaining office, wanting to retain that legislation in one's back pocket to continue the bad practices.
Sure. But the extent to which improvement has happened, it sounds as though it sits on goodwill. It rests on goodwill at an individual ministerial level, apart from anything else, as well as the general kind of government-to-government vibe, if you like.
Correct.
Is there anything that the Scottish Government can see as a plausible way of locking in the improvement that has happened, so that if a future UK government would still be required to work in as collegiate a way as can be achieved?
So there's a Westminster Convention that no future government can be bound by a current government. So that's the first thing to understand how the UK Parliament and governmental system operates. So to that extent, no, it's not. The arrangements that are currently there are not locked in, to Mr Harvey's term, in perpetuity. But these are the intergovernmental relations that we now have are, as Mr Mackey said earlier in evidence, were part of a process that involved devolved administrations as part of the process. So it does rest on the goodwill of governments working together. There are agreements in place, but as I've given in evidence, there is a range of examples that show that that is not working. So, notwithstanding the rhetoric, that there are examples of areas where meetings have not taken place at all. There are examples of where relations with the UK government are frankly performative, and we have a particularly bad recent example in relation to the recent UK child poverty strategy, which I'd be happy to update the committee if it wants another example of very bad practice. And that is the difference between saying, oh, we are interested theoretically in working with one another and we will keep one another updated on things, and then you learn about it either A, in newspapers the day before they're officially launched, or on the day in a press release.
Can I suggest a kind of change which, while it wouldn't absolutely lock in, you're right that we can't fundamentally bind future governments, but we could make it more likely that improvements to the relationship would persist if we made some changes around the public discussion around the intergovernmental space. Most of what we've talked about in the intergovernmental relationships is about what you described quite legitimately as the private space that's required for governments to discuss issues that are not yet in the public domain. And I respect that there's always going to be a need for that. But there isn't a public space in which those intergovernmental decisions, the grey area between the devolved and reserved split, is actually held accountable. When we talk about transparency, mostly we talk about our meeting minutes held or our reports going to be given, rather than whether there's any public process to it at all. To give you a comparison, here within the Scottish Parliament, for all of the period in which there's been a minority government, the government needs to negotiate with other political parties about the budget every year. And there needs to be some private space for that negotiation. But no one would pretend that that private negotiation is a substitute for public scrutiny, both before, during and after the budget process here in committees. Would the idea of some mechanism for Scottish and UK, or devolved Parliament and UK Parliament committees to meet jointly and call the ministers that they wish to call publicly to answer questions, would that actually create a built-in incentive for the kind of dialogue, the kind of not necessarily formal co-decision, but for making sure people are on the same page a little bit more? You gave the example of Erasmus, for example. If ministers about to make an announcement like that knew they were about to be asked in public about the Scottish funding arrangements, they'd have an incentive to say, we better know the answer.
Yep. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, going back to Mr Harvey's original question around locking things in, just a thought, of course, and I know the committee has looked at this issue, relates to the Sewell Convention being a convention. Mm-hmm. And one way, I think, of driving profound change through Whitehall would be having it on a statutory footing. Mm-hmm. Because if government departments in London knew that they were literally unable to continue acting, in particular as the last UK government did, and there are egregious examples of that being observed in the breach, and absolutely not being taken seriously. I think that would be a start, but Mr Harvey would be right to say that that would only revolve around areas of legislative consent motions as opposed to the day and daily intergovernmental relations, which he then moved on to.
It would also require a change to UK legislation to make that happen.
Indeed.
What I'm suggesting is a process of joint parliamentary scrutiny that would actually give ministers in both governments some incentive to behave better.
Yeah, I understand that. Now, I'll answer that in a couple of ways. I mean, firstly, in the same way as I answered Mr Kerr, I am open to workable suggestions about how intergovernmental relations can work better. I want to leave this committee and this Parliament and indeed UK government colleagues under no doubt that we are committed to trying to make these structures work as well as they can. It's no substitute for being a sovereign state and having to find workarounds, which is what this is. But we are open to thinking about new ways of doing things. But I would, forgive me, but I'd like to see the detail of how some of that might work, because I'm sure the UK government ministers would say that they would expect to be asked questions about this in the House of Commons. Now, I haven't read the report of the. I don't know if there was an oral statement on Erasmus Plus. I'm looking at colleagues here if they know there was one. There wasn't. Well, that surprises me, because that, of course, would have been an opportunity for Scottish members or anybody else to try and find out the funding implications of things. But I would agree that, Mr Harvey, that is still not enough, that there needs to be a better way. Now, I can give a commitment on behalf of the Scottish Government, and I have. I am taking away this issue of transparency to have a think about how can we provide better statistics, the likes of Mr Bibby asked about. But I think there's more than that, without getting into the territory of endangering the opportunity for having a process underway. I mean, to just give an example, and I'm going to describe this slightly elliptically for reasons that I think members will understand. We've been asked to take part in a process, a pretty important policy process in the UK, which involves how such a change might be managed with the terms of reference, how one would then have a green paper, how one might have a white paper. This is the process of things. And we have been asked for our input into this thing that really is pretty important in Scotland. And so we provided very detailed information in relation to this process. And I had a meeting about this where it was not apparent to me that a single consideration that had been shared with the UK government, not a single material consideration, had found its way into this apparent iterative process. So hurdle one, having been asked, we're very interested in hearing from you. We provide the information, as far as I'm aware, zero. And I asked, please, can you give me an example of anything that we have taken part in making its way into the process? And I acknowledge that unless parliamentarians are aware of this being the case, one cannot hold ministers to account. And so that's why I'm saying to Mr Harvey that I am open to thinking about ways in which we can do that better.
I mean, I think that...
Mr Harvey, there was a statement yesterday in the House of Commons on Erasmus Plus. Earlier, it was suggested there wasn't, but there was.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Cabinet Secretary, I think you put some of those points quite fairly. I think I'm just going to finish by asking you to acknowledge, though, that there is a difference between accountability and transparency. We talk about transparency in terms of providing information, but accountability needs something more than that. It needs the ability for decisions to be held democratically accountable in parliaments plural. And that even if there is improvement in the way the intergovernmental relationships take place, and that those improvements rest on goodwill, even when things are working well. For example, if the UK government does rely as the first port of call on common frameworks rather than using the powers contained in the Internal Market Act, if there's agreement, those common frameworks have been agreed between governments. They've never been signed off by Parliament. They don't require to be brought to Parliament for approval. And so there is a lack of accountability, even where there's some transparency.
So I acknowledge the point that Mr Harvey is making, and that there is a difference between the two. And I also acknowledge that both of these are the responsibility of parliamentarians in holding governments to account. I agree. The question then is, if things are suboptimal, what is it that needs to happen for parliamentarians to be able to hold ministers to account, ministers here, ministers elsewhere, and what format is transparency given? So the question Mr Bibby asked earlier about the number of meetings that have taken place, there is transparency in as much as our the meetings that ministers hold are publicly signed off and available, but they're perhaps not in a format that lends itself to holding a Cabinet Secretary to account in a way that should be as easy as it might. And so I say again, I am perfectly content to take away that and any other suggestions that the committee will have. I mean, no doubt you will be publishing your conclusions and you'll be considering a draft and you'll think about different ways in which, and I want to signal to the committee again, I am very open to hearing suggestions about how things might work better in this and in any other ways.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Ms Halcott Johnson.
Thanks very much, Convener. Good morning to Cabinet Secretary. I mean, I think the last, however, 20 minutes has probably highlighted one of the concerns I have with regards to perhaps the information that we're getting. I mean, notwithstanding some of the issues that you discussed with my colleague Stephen Kerr and some of the practical concerns that he has, and I think we all have in terms of the relationship, the information in the last and the language that we've heard, particularly from Mr Brown about contempt and imperious and suboptimal from yourself, I mean, it rather highlights, regardless of what's happening behind the scenes, the perception is always going to be, because it suits the government, the Scottish government, that it's not working. There are problems. Because it falls into the narrative that we've seen from the Scottish government that government isn't working, UK government is working, the union isn't working. And so how can we really get a proper idea of the Scottish government's position if that is the narrative that we see all the way through this Parliament?
Yeah. So, forgive me, but I don't think Mr Halker-Johnson was on the committee when I narrated my first experience of common frameworks.
No.
And I said to the committee then, and I'll say it again, and this was under the previous government, of which he knows I have been very critical in general, but I think the record shows very clearly. I gave an example of dealings that I had with a then UK Conservative Cabinet Office Minister, Chloe Smith, in relation to common frameworks, and where, because of her and my personal commitment that we were acting in good faith to try and find a solution to the lack of progress that at that time was happening around common frameworks, that neither of us understood. I was relatively new to office. I think she was probably relatively new to the Cabinet Office and didn't perhaps know the backstory to why was this not progressing. We said we understood no reason why this should not proceed, and if that was the case for us both, please can officials go away and can we meet again in however many, but not many weeks, and make progress. And I want to say that to Mr Halker-Johnson too. We understand in politics it's a contest of ideas. We know that. But I would want Mr Halker-Johnson and colleagues to know that we operate in good faith in relation to these interactions. And as I said to Mr Thomas Symonds when I discussed the gulf in custom and practice between the UK and the European Union and how it deals with information and a negotiating mandate and documentation and all the rest of it, I said to him that I acknowledged, no doubt, that there would be some people within Whitehall who might not be tremendously keen for that amount of information to be shared, because would there not be a risk of, I don't know, leaks? And I said to him that I would be very confident that, having called for something like this to happen, that it wouldn't be happening from us, because were that to be the case, it just would not continue. I observe, of course, that this has ended up in the newspapers before it was announced in Parliament. We knew nothing about it, so it couldn't have been the Scottish Government, I say with slightly tongue-in-cheek, by way of context. But the first point I want to make is genuinely made, which is to say that it is in all of our interests, because often a lot of what we're dealing with are quite technical issues. Often they're not matters of party political difference at all. It's about reaching best administrative decisions or how to make systems work. There's not tremendous political advantage for anybody, certainly not for anything performative. And I agree with these, with anything to do with intergovernmental relations, and this isn't a Scottish or a UK, European, or indeed it's a much wider issue with this. I think having a performative approach to these things does not serve anybody well. And that's certainly not my position, nor of the Scottish Government's. But I do think it cannot be beyond the wit of the UK Government to understand that where there are workable practices, where we're working in parallel. This is the other thing in relation to, in particular, the European Union stuff, where, ironically, the Scottish Government can be better informed because of what we hear in Brussels in relation to EU-UK matters than we do from the UK Government. Now, that's an extraordinary state of... And I'm sure everybody would agree that is not the way things should be operating. So, given we know that there are established ways of these working, Mr. Kerr drew attention to that. This is how the European Union works, and he's a Eurosceptic. That if it's possible for some of this to work in these ways elsewhere, why on earth can't we try that here? And by all means, if there's a feeling, well, let's try it with a government department where this is particularly relevant, take, for example, in the European Union context, that would be really, really good.
I accept the points, and I think we've all accepted the points that there are concerns here. I suppose the point I'm making is that it's hard to get into the things happening behind the scenes and how well that's working when there is a narrative from the Scottish Government that, regardless of those things, some of the things working and some things not, that things aren't working. The Scottish Government I mean, let's be clear, doesn't want devolution to work because the ultimate aim is independence. We know that. So how can... I'm slightly dubious about the idea that Keith Brownhide said that the punters have to know about the idea. I don't think the punters care about this inquiry. I think they care about hospitals, roads and all the other things that matter. But where there is that perspective or that narrative from the Scottish Government, regardless of what's happening, that it's not working, the government relations isn't working, the relationship with the UK government isn't working, it's hard to get to actually dig down into minutiae of the issues that, as I say, has been discussed with Stephen Kerr, where there could be improvement, and perhaps Patrick Harvey even suggested there are areas where there could be improvements. Yeah,
but I think, in fairness, if Mr Halker-Johnson were to reflect on the evidence I've given this morning, I have been very nuanced in the reflections that I've given on how things work. I have pointed to the fact that there are ministers, there are examples where intergovernmental relations have been observed in the spirit and the letter of agreed ways of working together. I've acknowledged that. And I have also acknowledged that there are colleagues with whom I have a very good working relationship. And there are examples of things that are really challenging because of timescales. Because governments... Sorry, I'm not taking out a tiny violin and expecting colleagues, parliamentarians, to have tremendous sympathy for this. But where you're a government that is also having to satisfy parliamentary procedures and oversight, it really matters that we understand how things operate in different parts of the UK. And I can give Mr Halker-Johnson the assurance. I have been involved in processes where I've had UK government colleagues coming and saying, I appreciate that this will be difficult for you. Is there a way that we can work through this? And I give him the assurance that I have worked in good faith to do that. Because if one is going to have to work together for 4 years, 5 years on things, one has to show good faith. Because if all one is going to do is suggest that nothing works, not be prepared to work in good faith, not be prepared to compromise about things, nothing's going to work. And I give him that is not how it operates.
Well, I welcome that. I mean, we've all sat on committees where, for example, SSIs or legislation has come through from the UK government and then come through late from the Scottish government to be considered. And sometimes it is the responsibility of Scottish government that it's late. Sometimes it is the responsibility of UK government. And hopefully we've all kind of accepted that. If I could just kind of move to another point, because some of the concerns that you've raised and some of the issues that and the frustrations I think you've raised, which again I think we can accept that some of them are understandable, are some of the same frustrations that local government in Scotland has with UK government, or can be, in terms of that relationship engagement at the moving. And I'm not asking to kind of put particular examples, but I suppose, are there areas where, firstly, would you recognise that? And secondly, are there areas where the relationship with, say, the Scottish government and local government could provide more of a guide in terms of those relationships with the UK government?
Well, I reflect on the fact that I have regular meetings with colleagues from the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities. And so that would be primarily in the culture space for me in terms of my portfolio. And we have a very good working relationship. And we acknowledge where there are challenges. So it won't be a surprise to this committee, because I also have culture as part of, so for example, libraries is a major issue in many parts of Scotland. It's a challenge for local government, and it's an issue for the Scottish government, because we want to see the library network protected, and so we have an ongoing dialogue. Now that seems to work well, but I think probably some of the issues that colleagues have brought up here, one might want to have a better understanding. Maybe that's for the local government committee. I don't know. Forgive me, I hadn't...
I appreciate it. It's more so in your experiences of working there. But I mean, I recognise they're not. There are differences between the two relationships, but it's just in terms of, best practice, whether there's anything like that. If I can just kind of finish on a more practical issue that was raised, and it's kind of been hinted at in the conversations here today. A huge amount of the work that goes on is civil servants behind the scenes. There is a recognition, probably from both sides, that some of the civil servants, as part of the Scottish Government, don't always understand the pressures that UK civil servants work under, and vice versa, and how's the implications. And it was suggested that there could be more exchange, more opportunities for working. I know there is some. I think we were down there just before or after a week of kind of engagement. I was wondering if that's something that could be considered more, that interaction between civil servants and officials, and perhaps to allow both sides to get a better understanding of some of the challenges.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask Mr Mackey to share some insights from a civil service perspective, which will probably be more interesting than me sharing my view on it. But the first thing that I would say is acknowledging, there is not a Scottish and or a UK civil service. No. There's a GB civil service, and there is a Northern Irish civil service. Those are the only two different civil services in the United Kingdom. And I regularly hear my civil service colleagues saying, oh, they're off to have a meeting with, their fellow permanent secretaries, and they just come back from London and they were at that government department speaking with their opposite numbers and that weren't really well, or they were in another department and that worked less well. And so I have always had the impression that there is a very professional relationship between the civil servants that work to the Scottish Government, and in the interactions that I've had with UK civil servants, GB civil servants, get my terminologies right, working to the UK Government, that we are dealing with a very professional civil service.
I wouldn't question that at all. And as I say, it's actually, I think, a more a positive. It's simply that perhaps that lack of not just meetings, not just sitting in an office for a day, but actually some of those practical experiences that they see. What happens when a piece of legislation is delayed, or the budget is put late, and things like that.
So yes, undoubtedly. Ask Mr Mackey to come in a nanosecond. But we'd also say not to overlook the fact that there's a regular churn in the civil service. And as regularly you will hear, a civil servant who is working to the Scottish Government has moved on to the DWP, as was the case with the last permanent secretary here. And throughout all of the grades of the civil service, there will be movement between both. So there is a level of insight. Could there be more? At that point, I'll pass over to Mr Mackey.
Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. So I suppose I'll make a couple of points. One is that I think, working in the team that we do, we're acutely aware of the pressures that UK Government civil servants are working under, and that consideration of devolution issues is just one of the considerations they're having to make. They're also having to work with Treasury colleagues or Downing Street colleagues. So we are acutely aware of that. And one of the points that we try to make, certainly when we are trying to upskill civil servants across the Scottish Government, is to help people be more empathetic towards some of the pressures that their UK Government colleagues are working under, because that is a pathway to better understanding and better collaboration. So I think from a Scottish Government perspective, there certainly is an awareness of that. In terms of what the UK Government is doing about that and trying to improve it, I would say that they are making a great deal of effort on that. They have a devolution unit within the Cabinet Office which tries to drive improvements of understanding of devolution across the UK civil service. Devolution Learning Week was the event I think you alluded to that has recently happened, which is a series of online events for civil servants right across the UK Government and the Scottish Government and the Wales Government for that matter, to learn more about devolution. There is also, last year there was I think maybe actually earlier this year, the completion of a shadowing pilot, which was seek to match civil servants from Scottish and UK Government departments to help drive better understanding across that department. And we're hopeful that will run again next year. There's certainly a proposal in the works. So we as a team within the Scottish Government and the Cabinet Office team are committed to improving that devolution capability right across the UK and the Scottish Government as well.
And sorry, just a snippet of insight into that, which didn't fall immediately to mind. Just to confirm to Mr Halker-Johnson, I have turned up to meetings where I would recognise my civil service colleagues that I would normally be dealing with and said, oh, here's a colleague from the whichever UK government department who is here and shadowing. Is that okay? Mm-hmm. To which I've always said, absolutely. So just to give some assurance that there are these different approaches to try and make things work better. Does that help us, though, ultimately with our challenges? Well, it can do, but not necessarily.
Yeah. And just last very quickly, if that, and it's perhaps one that Mr Backey could with this. One of the issues, one of the points I think was raised almost in line with that was that it's not always a question of departments, say, with the UK government ignoring Scotland and Scottish issues. Some of the big departments in the UK government ignore other departments in the UK government because they are so siloed, so focused on their areas. Is that an issue that you would kind of accept, or a I don't know if it's an excuse, but you know.
No. I can't obviously speak for UK government civil servants. I suppose when we did some work over the summer to identify how the reset was proceeding, the thing that we found was certainly an inconsistency of approach from different UK departments, and some of that was based on just a lack of sophistication in relation to devolution, because they potentially hadn't dealt with a devolution issue previously, and some of it was a good level of devolution capability within that. But you're absolutely right. You know, for a Ministry of Justice or a ministry that largely deals with an issue that's wholly reserved to Scotland, the interaction might be intermittent and not on a regular basis. Whereas if you're looking at an organisation such as DEFRA at the moment, which is dealing with a lot of the EU considerations, they might be more adept at it. So there will be an inconsistency there.
I said siloed. I perhaps should have said focused on their own areas. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Sorry, can we
sorry, apologies for the throat lozenge and the cold. I'm conscious we are over time for what we expected for this agenda item, but I know Mr Brown and Mr Bibby are keen to come in. Mr Brown, was that supplementary to what we've just been discussing?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll let you come in quickly and then I'll go to Mr Bibby.
It was on that last answer and the point that you just raised yourself, convener, about ambivalence versus contempt. I think the contempt argument I made has been borne out by the comments of Jamie Halker-Johnson when he purports to say that anything from the SNP is going to be discarded because they believe in independence and there could be no improvements in the meantime. That's another example of the contempt that we saw from the previous government. That's exactly what you said. But the point that was made about ambivalence, 2006, a report was produced for Jack McConnell as First Minister, which excoriated the UK government for most departments not even being aware of the need to talk about devolution. When we were in London, I forget if it was a senior civil servant or somebody from a think tank, said that now, in 2025-26, we're actually only just in the foothills of devolution. So the prospects of any immediate change without people standing back and taking stock of it seem pretty remote. If the senior civil servants in London are saying, well, we're still in the early days, it's 20-odd years since that time, surely it should have moved on in the meantime. And the fact that it hasn't means we're going to have to do something quite different to affect that change. And I'm talking about within the context of the union now, nothing to do with independence, if you want to see an improvement.
I totally agree, and I think riffing off the point about different departmental realities, I think joining those two things together is key. And so where my example around trade was made, and trade agreements, and the absence of meaningful interaction around areas where there would be very significant interest or devolved locus, is a problem. And it's a problem in governmental terms. I mean, it's a matter of political discourse. Foreign affairs is reserved, so you can't have any external affairs, which, as we all know, is total nonsense. But this is a reflection of that very same point, which is that there's a lack of understanding. But hey, we're living in an asymmetrical union where our main public service broadcaster still thinks that it's accurate every single day to report that the government is doing something. So, this is...
Or the unemployment has risen.
Indeed,
Which is
but
not Scotland.
the government, when there are more than one government in the United Kingdom, this would never happen in Germany, never happen in Austria, never happen in Belgium, and, which, if we want to draw a circle back to the main points that we've been discussing, it is about an attitude. It's about an attitude towards how things can work. So if we're coming to the end of this particular agenda item, convener, I would want to stress again and briefly that we will do everything that we can to try and make systems work, and if there are ways that systems can be included for transparency and accountability, I'm very open to that. But in terms of the bigger picture, we need to understand that we are dealing with an attitude which has not changed that much through devolution, which is what the point that Mr Brown has been making, and he is correct.
There's been a lot of talk about perceptions and vibes, and I asked the Cabinet Secretary earlier about the number of meetings because I wanted to establish some facts, and I think that would be helpful to have that information. But in terms of like things that the Scottish Government has said, the Cabinet Secretary in written submission to the committee said the Scottish Government was not informed of the proposed UK-US trade deal ahead of the announcement. Is that the Cabinet Secretary's, position and understanding? I know he said earlier he's not got responsibility for intergovernmental relations, but the Scottish Government was not informed of the proposed UK-US trade deal ahead of its announcement.
No, it's not that there are proposed deals in theory, or that negotiations may be underway. It's not that. Of course, these are more often than not these are shared in public, and they're a matter of public reporting. It is the substance of the process. So I was not involved in this, so I don't know the detail. But I mean, were there any inquiries from the UK government in relation to the different headline areas that may have been discussed, like pharmaceuticals? I don't know the answer to that, but we, in terms of where the deal ended up, that did not involve the Scottish Government being involved in any meaningful process whatsoever.
Well, I wasn't involved in the discussions either, so I don't really know the extent to which there was discussions about the UK-US trade deal between Scottish Government and UK Government. But I do know, because there's been an FOI done back in September, there was a Freedom of Information published correspondence between the Scottish and UK governments on the UK-US trade deal, and from that, email exchanges between the Minister for Trade Policy, Douglas Alexander, Minister for Business, Richard Lockhead, First Minister, Deputy First Minister, other Scottish Government and UK Government officials. So, even just from that Freedom of Information request, we know there was discussions ongoing about because it says about the discussions that were ongoing between UK and Scottish Government officials on that particular issue. Now, that won't be the sum total, I'm sure, of the discussions that were happening in the UK-US trade deal. But when you talked about nuance earlier.
Yeah, understood.
For the Scottish Government to say we weren't informed of the UK-US trade deal when there's actually evidence and facts to suggest there were extensive discussions ongoing about it, I think we need to be a bit more caveated about our statements in relation to intergovernmental relations.
So I agree, and I think words are quite important in this, and this is why the danger of a performative process by letter exchange, being informed that there are trade negotiations, that's not the same thing as having a detailed conversation about the process, about the potential upsides and downsides. And I would be perfectly happy to go away and review the correspondence that Mr Bibby has drawn my attention to, because I'd be interested to see the level of detail that was part of that about what was being considered in relation to pharmaceuticals. So my issue is not about necessarily being informed. Of course we were informed that there was a UK-EU agreement process. Of course there were. We had meetings about it. I've given evidence about it. That's not the major issue. The major issue is about the content, and it is about when this is beyond the rhetoric of reset point that I was making before. It's not even just so much as we know that things weren't great before, let's make them better now. It's what, in terms of substance, is happening as part of this process. So I'd be interested in the substance in relation to pharmaceuticals, just as I was interested in the substance of what was happening with fishing, interested in the substance of having information shared with us which was not, which was being shared with other European Union. So Mr Bibby is absolutely right. What matters is the substance. It's not about the performative, if there is such a thing, element to the fact that there are meetings, the fact that we do send each other letters. It's about, are the contents of letters, of discussions, of meetings, are things taken on board, do things happen as a result of them, and do we have better policy as a result? Surely the outcome is the most important thing in all of that. But I have definitely taken Mr Bibby's point away about having the best possible marshalling of information going forward.
I just want to say I agree with the Cabinet Secretary on the importance of substance.
Okay, thank you.
Delighted that's being minuted.
If I could just have a final question, Cabinet Secretary. In our report and the work that we've done, the Seoul Convention, we recommended that there should be a memorandum of understanding, which the UK government agreed would be a good way forward as well. Has there been any substantive work done on that?
I think the short answer is not as much as we would like. I'll hand over to Mr Mackey, who's a bit more closely involved in. I mean, it is a bit surprising that we are now the length of time since the last UK general election, and we still have not received that memorandum of understanding or making substantive process.
I would say that there is discussions ongoing at an official level about that memorandum of understanding about what might be in it, and we as a Scottish Government officials are working collaboratively with the UK Government to try and bring about a wording that we could potentially put to ministers. Yeah.
Is there an indicative timescale when that work might be completed?
Well, I think there is hope that we could potentially have something to put to ministers shortly, on the basis that we have a looming Scottish parliamentary election, which I think would change matters. But we're working as quickly as we can.
Okay.
And we'll be happy to keep the committee informed of any substantive progress
that would be very
in that
helpful.
area.
Thank you. I'm going to suspend for 5 minutes before we move on to agenda item 2. Thank you. Thanks. Welcome back to the committee. Our second agenda item today is to conclude taking evidence in the legal mechanism for an independence referendum inquiry. And we're joined once again by Angus Robertson, Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, External Affairs and Culture. And welcome to committee Luke McBratney, Deputy Director of Elections, Constitutional Projects at the Scottish Government. And if I could, just before we bring in other members, we've heard in our evidence that in the inquiry, that in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling, the Scottish Parliament does not have the competence to legislate for another independence referendum. Is there any merit in seeking to formally establish the circumstances in which a referendum could take place?
Well, I think there are for any number of reasons. I mean, firstly, in a democratic society, I think when parties win elections on manifestos, that consent from the losing side in elections, acknowledging that a government has a right to make progress in delivering its manifesto, is really important for the democratic health of a country. And unfortunately, on the constitutional question, things have moved on since 2014 with a range of different rhetorical devices being used to stop a referendum taking place on Scottish independence. That is notwithstanding the repeated elections of a majority of parliamentarians to this Parliament elected with a mandate for there to be such a referendum. Now, we need to separate something out here. This is not, my point here, is not about whether one is for independence or not. This is, as Democrats living in a country where referenda have been the mechanism used to agree constitutional change, where we have a precedent on there being an independence referendum and the way in which that worked. And now we're in a situation where we have a mechanism in Northern Ireland that can, through the ballot box, determine constitutional change for Northern Ireland. So that's a de jure mechanism in Northern Ireland. We have a de facto mechanism for England, because with 85% of the population and an overwhelming majority in the UK Parliament, if there were a move for constitutional change in England, that there is a mechanism through Westminster for constitutional change in England, but none exists, no mechanism exists formally acknowledged in Scotland or Wales. We have and I'm sure you have seen this, convener, we have a long list of statements from past British Prime Ministers, political leaders from across the political spectrum at Westminster and indeed in the Scottish Parliament, saying that it is for the people to be able to decide on this question, and that being the case, surely there must be a mechanism for this to take place. As a Democrat, for me there is only one route for all of this, which is through the ballot box and a process which is legal, constitutional and agreed, because that is a requirement for international recognition. And the fact that we have already done this tells me that there is a way to be able to do this, but it requires those who are opposed to Scottish independence as Democrats acknowledging that it is a democratic right for people to determine constitutional change in Scotland. The history of Northern Ireland is, of course, not a direct comparison with Scotland. I acknowledge that. Having said that, a mechanism exists there for their constitutional future, but not here. And that it's just not sustainable. It needs to change. It doesn't need to be complicated. It just needs agreement as Democrats that the people of Scotland should be able to determine their future on becoming an independent state. And for me, that is for our Parliament to determine.
Thank you. Cabinet Secretary, would you move to questions from the committee? I'll bring in Mr Brown first.
Just on the point you've made, the difference in the UK, say from Spain, which you've heard about, which Spain does not allow a legal mechanism for a referendum on independence of any of its constituent parts. But Spain also does not acknowledge a right to self-determination for those areas. In the UK, apparently, various Prime Ministers or the Smith Commission have explicitly stated the idea that Scotland should have the right to decide on its own future. It's in the Smith Commission signed up to by the UK Government. In the recent change to the constitution of the Turks and Caicos Island by the UK Government, they've recognised and facilitated a legal mechanism, and the Cabinet Secretary has mentioned in Northern Ireland there's a mechanism there to do it. But in the UK it seems to be the case that they acknowledge and apparently support the right for Scotland to exercise self-determination, but it can only be done at the whim of a Westminster government. Now, self-determination, when it's decided by somebody else, is not self-determination. It cannot be. If you have a right to exercise it, it's got to be approved by somebody else. That is not self-determination. So is that the key point here, which I think in summary of the evidence we've heard so far, is that the UK says it recognises Scotland's right, but it is deliberately withholding the ability for Scotland to exercise that right, and it keeps jealously to its own kind of heart the idea that it's only the UK government that can decide this. In that way, it can prevent that right from being exercised. The two things seem very odd in the international context from what we've heard, that they recognise the right, but they refuse to facilitate the exercise of that right.
So I agree with that, and it's a contradictory position. Not just in terms, but in publicly stated positions. The position of the leaders of the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish Liberal Democrats in June 2014 was, and I quote, "Power lies with the Scottish people, and we believe it is for the Scottish people to decide how we are governed." The Smith Commission, 2014, I quote, "Nothing in this report prevents Scotland becoming an independent country in the future, should the people of Scotland so decide." And then another, I think, very strong quote, "Mandates come from the electorate in an election. It should be for the people of Scotland that decide when the next referendum is." That quote is from Anis Sarwar. And I could go on. I mean, and it doesn't matter whether these politicians, I could go back to Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Theresa May, who've all said similar things. There has been an acknowledgement by people who do not support Scottish independence that self-determination, and self-determination is a key point in Mr Brown's question, is something that is an inalienable right to the people of Scotland. And that being the case, to be unprepared to answer the simple question, and repeatedly so, by which mechanism can Scotland secure a referendum on independence, is withholding the right of self-determination. It is a denial of democracy. And there are a number of rhetorical flourishes that are thrown into the debate. Again, they are there for the reasons to stymie. Now is not the time. Things are required to be the settled will. A whole series of different things which are absolutely and totally irrelevant to the simple question which you have asked about what is the mechanism. I think all of us agree as Democrats, I'm sure we all agree, we would avow that the only route for significant constitutional change is through the ballot box. The question, though, for all of us to answer is, without cavilling on it, is how can that be secured? Now, the good news is we've done it. And when a majority in this Parliament were elected in the 2011 session, the UK government acknowledged that the Parliament had been elected with a majority on a manifesto commitment that a referendum should take place. And that is exactly what happened. Now, though, and we've had a number of elections since here, including this current Parliament, where a majority of members have been elected on a manifesto commitment that there should be a referendum, it is being blocked. So we have the de facto consideration of blocking, and we have the de jure challenge that others, those who oppose independence, not all, incidentally, there are some observers out there. I've read commentary from the likes of Kenny Farquharson, a Scottish columnist, who's made the point himself, as somebody who did not support Scottish independence, that there should be a mechanism, there must be a mechanism, and this issue is not going to go away. I acknowledge that there are strongly held views for and against independence, for and against the Union. That is not the question before us. The question is, what is the democratic mechanism through which, at the present time, at least half of the Scottish electorate are in support of Scottish independence. Actually, a higher percentage believe that one should be able to make a decision about it. We have precedent. We have different ways in which this happens. We have other parts of the world. Mr. Brown mentioned other parts of the world. Quebec. The National Assembly in Quebec has the right to decide whether there should be a referendum, which we don't. So it's perfectly possible elsewhere. It should be possible here. And the longer it goes on, the more unsustainable and, frankly, corrosive it gets for our democratic culture, because it is a roadblock on democratic decision-making. It is a denial of a democratic right of self-determination.
I wonder, though, if the Cabinet Secretary is able to... he rightly says that the various parties that oppose a referendum have not been able to state what the mechanism is for exercising a right that they acknowledge, which seems absurd, but that's where we are. In fact, none of the Unionist members of this committee have offered any explanation as to what the mechanism might be either. Does he have an idea of why, given the fact it was agreed in 2012 to have the referendum in 2014, why the UK government then agreed that it was a compelling mandate, and why we've had this once in a generation, now is not the time, all the prevarication that we've talked about for the last 11 years or so. What does he think is in the mind of successive UK governments that are trying to block this? Is it because they fear that this time people will vote for independence of Scotland, or is there another reason, do you think?
That is the only rational explanation that I have for this. If we cast our minds back to the 2011 Scottish Parliament election and the process by which the then UK Prime Minister was able to agree a process with the Scottish Government, was done on the basis that, yes, a majority had been elected to the Scottish Parliament, but that support at that time for independence, I think I'm right in saying, was in the 20s. And so I think the calculation for the then UK Prime Minister was that he thought that this was a concession which would lead to a no vote, and it would then stop the debate. It would end the question. And the difference now, of course, is not only do a majority in this Parliament support independence, a majority in the country support it. So I'm seeing some shaking heads. I would just point to all of the independent polling that one is able to, which one is able to, and the average of those polls show that support for yes is ahead of no. But I mean, even if it weren't, it doesn't negate the point that I'm making, which is that the difference for the starting point of a referendum in 2025, 2026, 2027 is not in the 20s%. It is de minimis in the 40s, and as recent polls have showed, of those who have a view on how they would vote, it is more than 50%. That, to me, is the only rational explanation as to why one is seeking to block a democratic a democratic choice, but also a mechanism to be able to exercise that choice. And I'm really sorry, but for colleagues who support that position, I think looking at oneself in the mirror and being honest about the reasons why one is seeking to stop a vote simply because one does not like the potential outcome does not behove us as Democrats. Because all of us, when we go into elections, know that we might be elected or not, re-elected or not, and we're prepared to stand for election in that context. And indeed, when it comes to wider constitutional issues, these are, of course, decisions that have been taken. Take devolution, for example, on which we have had a number of referenda. And on Europe, we have had a number of referenda. People's views change. We now have, I think I'm right in saying, around about 1 million people living in Scotland who did not vote, who weren't able to vote in the 2014 referendum. And of course, we have a material change of circumstances since the last vote, having been promised that we should, if we were to vote no, that we would remain in the European Union, and since then have, of course, been taken out of the European Union when a majority in Scotland voted to remain, and we were missold. And so not only is there a strong rhetorical case for there to be a referendum, we have election after election after election. So what will it take for those who are not supportive of the outcome, but as Democrats agree that the only acceptable mechanism that we have to determine our future in governmental terms or in constitutional terms is the ballot box? And instead of seeking rhetorical routes to put off answering this actually quite simple question, or indeed, the other simple point is, how on earth is it sustainable to have a mechanism in one part of the United Kingdom but not the other? It's just not sustainable.
My last question really is on, you've mentioned the distinction between de jure and de facto referenda. The English legal system has a principle called stare decisis, which means to look back at previous decisions as precedent, essentially. Very strongly based on that principle. It's not the same in Scotland, incidentally. But given that, and given the fact that we have had an agreed referendum back in 2014, does he think that adds to what seems to be, to many people, not to everybody, an overwhelming argument for the Scottish people having the right to decide? If we've done this once, we've done it before, it's been agreed in the past, it's now at least 11 years since that happened. None of the reasons for it for not doing it stack up, really. So another mandate for the Scottish Parliament with a majority of people supporting independence, surely that should lead to, if the English principle of stare decisis is being followed, the same kind of agreement.
So, I mean, I have to be absolutely frank with Mr Brown. I'm not a lawyer, nor am I a legal academic or expert in any sense. So I don't feel that I'm suitably qualified to answer his question about English law. I would observe, it's been very well reported, the Supreme Court judgment in relation to the ability of the Scottish Parliament to hold a referendum, as in us being able to decide as parliamentarians in the Scottish Parliament that that should be the case. And everything that I have seen has advised me that it is unlikely that the Supreme Court would make any different decision to that which it made before, which gets us back to the same conundrum and challenge that we have been discussing since the beginning of this session, which is it is a matter of political will, political decision-making and consensus as Democrats that the democratic process should be at the heart of determining our political and constitutional future. And we have a precedent. So, given we have a precedent that we know was agreeable to the UK government, would have been recognised internationally as a result had Scotland voted yes in 2014, I am of the view that we should secure the agreement through the ballot box that that is exactly what should happen again if a majority of parliamentarians are returned to this Parliament. Because otherwise, I mean, really, there's a next conversation, which is the future of political culture in Scotland. If we have a blocking minority, as in the people who lost the election, are telling those who elected and represent the largest group of people who voted in that election that they cannot do or have or exercise the choice which they have voted in for. That is pretty serious, and it is not sustainable. It can't go on. So, what is the solution? The solution is to do what David Cameron did, which is avow. There is a route, not just the rhetorical avowal of the right of self-determination that we've already narrated this morning. We also know that there is a route by which this can happen. I would wish this to be a standing right of the Scottish Parliament, to be able to determine its future whenever a majority of people elected to this place, acting on behalf of the people who have elected them to come here, that they should be able to determine that this is what should happen. There is no substitute for that. It's a pretty simple question. Are we democrats, yes or no? If we are, do we believe the public should be able to exercise a right about their constitutional future of the country, yes or no? Yes, I agree with both of those things. And that being the case, what's the mechanism? And it's time for those who cast doubt on this to be absolutely clear about de minimis. De minimis. It has to match that which exists for one of the other constituent nations of the United Kingdom, which is Northern Ireland.
I just say, though, on the referendum, there was commitments given, as you remember, that if Scotland voted no, this Parliament would be constitutionally protected, in fact that it couldn't be abolished, that the Sewell Convention would be made law, that Scotland's place in the EU was guaranteed, all of which turned out to be lies. However, the Smith Commission sat after that referendum, and the other parties, opposition, the unionist parties, supported Scotland's right to exercise its right to self-determination. Were they acting in bad faith, do you think?
So I think at the time, because it was thought that there wouldn't be a clamour for another referendum, it was a simple thing to concede, because intellectually, if one is in favour of the right of self-determination and one is a democrat, how could one say anything other than that? And I haven't spoken with any members of the Smith Commission since. I've got no reason to believe that they acted in bad faith then, but I do think that having said what they said then, looking back, given the situation in which we find ourselves now, a Parliament with a majority elected for there to be such a referendum, that there is a significant inconsistency there. And again, the only explanation that I can alight on, because it isn't intellectual, is a political consideration that the starting position for a referendum campaign is that de minimis 50% of those who express an opinion on how they would vote yes or no would vote yes. And so it's more of a consideration on the risk of losing a referendum than on the principle of A, democratic values, or B, democratic processes. So I cast no aspersions on the members of the Smith Commission then. I would be interested to hear what they say now, because it would be very inconsistent for any of them, or indeed the political parties that signed up to them, and that is the Scottish Conservative Party, the Scottish Labour Party and the Scottish Liberal Democrats, that they now take a position which is diametrically opposed to something that they agreed to in 2014.
Well, thankfully, we're a member of the Smith Commission here. So. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Mr Kerr, please?
Yeah, I mean, what the evidence that, returning to the substance of this inquiry, which, of course, is fundamentally political, the evidence was very clear that in the United Kingdom we have quite a liberal, quite a permissive constitutional arrangement. I think flexibility, I think, was mentioned quite frequently. Isn't the truth of the matter that this is about politics? And if you and Keith and the other nationalists on this committee and in this Parliament want to have another referendum. You have to persuade the majority of the people of Scotland. Isn't that fundamentally what politics is about? It's about a battle of ideas. I mean, do you agree with that?
So I think Mr. Kerr is conflating two different things. Firstly, the right to be able to decide, and secondly, coming to a view on the principal question. These are two quite distinct things, and I would draw gently his attention to the percentage with which the UK Conservative and Unionist Party was elected under David Cameron and delivered a Brexit referendum which was not over 50%. It was a government elected, by my memory, in the mid-30s, and then legislated for a Brexit referendum which delivered the result that it did. And so I deploy that fact in my answer to Mr. Kerr, because, of course, he supported the Conservative Party when it was elected then, and he supported there being a Brexit referendum. And I think I'm right in saying that he voted in favour of Brexit.
I certainly
so
did.
he was able to exercise a democratic right, delivered in a parliamentary election in the mid-30s, not the 50s, 30s. And so that's why I think conflating these two things is not the right way to go about this. There's a basic point here about the people having the right of self-determination.
You've got to
and
persuade
when they
people to
vote
for
a parliament, when they vote for a parliament to be able to have that opportunity to say yes as well as to say no, Mr. Kerr, the right to say either of those things, that is the best way of doing it. And the reason we know it's the best way of doing it is because we've done it already and there's precedent.
It's a political issue, and it will be resolved, as these matters are, by people voting. So it's up to you, Angus Robertson and Keith Brown and the other nationalists in this committee and in this Parliament, and we have an opportunity very shortly to have an election. It's up to you to make the case for that. I think you will find, and I think you already know this, some of you are honest enough in your hearts to know this, the vast majority of the people of Scotland have got more pressing considerations and priorities, and that, I'm sure, will shape how people vote. But this is fundamentally a question of politics, because the constitutional arrangements are very clear, the law is very clear, and the whole issue is determined, as you have said, and as we would say, as a matter of democratic process. That's how it's been done in the past, that's how it's done in this country, and that's the way it will be done in the future. And I think the whole inquiry, frankly, has been a fatuous waste of time, because what we've heard in evidence, time and time again, is what we already knew. That the Supreme Court judgment makes it clear that these powers rest with the Sovereign Parliament of the United Kingdom. And as I say, the evidence also that we've received from many of the experts stacked heavily in the corner of those who say that this country has a very liberal, flexible constitutional arrangement, and the evidence of the past proves that.
So I didn't discern a question there from Mr. Kerr, but I would observe it's a very,
I was taking a leaf out of Keith Brown's book. I was making a statement.
But it's a very, very good example of the view from those people who are unprepared as Democrats to answer the question, what is the mechanism? We have a mechanism in Northern Ireland. Why should that mechanism not also exist here? That we can agree, I can agree with Mr. Kerr, shock horror for those watching these proceedings, that the UK, because it has an unwritten constitution, can have he used the word flexibility to make different... But the point that I'm making is...
And it's benign as well, that's the thing. It's benign.
We have different treatment, we have a different status for the different nations of this union. And that is unsustainable. Well, it cannot go on. How many elections need to return a majority to this place? And that is significantly more than the Conservative Party secured when they then legislated for a Brexit referendum. for there to be a referendum about Scotland's
I think it's worth reading the evidence that we've
Still no
received,
answer.
Cabinet Secretary, because the evidence in relation to the disparities you describe and the unique circumstances of Northern Ireland were well explored by our legal experts, our constitutional experts. But I think in the interest of time, because time does press on, I think I've made my view clear, as well as hearing the Cabinet Secretary's answer to my question. It is a matter of politics and debate, and of course we're about to have an exciting year, a few months, the first part of this year, all about that. Good.
Mr Halker-Johnson.
Well, I mean, I certainly agree with my friend and colleague Stephen Kerr. I know you'll be shocked, Mr Brown, by that, but I mean, it has been a bit of a damn squib because we've been told essentially what we know. There has been some useful clarifying points, I think, certainly from some of the experts, particularly around, as Mr Kerr pointed out, this is a political point. Before I ask, because I just want to pick you up, Cabinet Secretary, on some of the things that you've said so far. I mean, firstly, around independence parties, independence majority, a mandate. Going into the last election, both Lorna Slater, who's the co-leader of the Greens, and Nicola Sturgeon suggested that those who voted for those parties could still be against independence, but their vote wouldn't be counted. So that rather puts into question this idea that that's a pure mandate for independence, and of course the majority of the public wasn't on. In terms of the EU argument, as again Better Together, the argument that Better Together promised staying in the EU is a false one, and it's been repeatedly proved to be false. In terms of how it's been perceived by SNP politicians, because it was quite simple what Better Together said. They said that if the only way to stay in the EU was to vote no, because voting yes meant that we left a member state of the EU, and therefore we left the EU, and that was clarified in a letter from the EU Commission to a committee of this Parliament. And also the term against our being brought out of the EU against our will. I voted Remain, but my will was that the result was honoured. So across the United Kingdom, the vote was to leave, and so we left. And in the same way that had in 2014 Scotland voted to leave the UK, I would have wanted to see it honoured, despite the fact you'll appreciate, and I'm sure it will come as no shock to you that I voted to stay in the UK. And of course, this isn't a priority for the public. I think it was 7th, 8th, may even be lower in terms of the priority for the public. There isn't a clamour for independence or another independence referendum at the moment. The question I wanted, and I'm sure you may want to readdress some of those points, but the question I wanted to ask was, at the SNP conference, I think earlier this year, John Swinney highlighted that there was a plan, a secret plan, it's been described, to deliver independence. Well, it's the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, who suggested it was a secret plan. Can you tell us details of that? Or can you tell us if one exists?
Right. So again, I just reflect on the opportunity. The opportunity for a member that's not in favour of independence to be able to suggest by which democratic mechanism the people might be able to determine the future of their country, again, totally absent.
Well, I'm asking
sorry,
you.
I'm answering
So you're giving evidence to us.
I'm answering Mr. Halker-Johnson's observations. He said an interesting thing. He talked about Lorna Slater and people saying that a vote for the Scottish Greens and by extension in the SNP was not a mandate for independence of itself. And I agree. What it is, though, it is a mandate for a referendum. Because in our manifestos, the Scottish National Party manifesto and the Scottish Green Party manifesto, both parties, and that is the majority in this Parliament, were elected on a manifesto commitment that there should be a referendum. I would never, ever pray and aid somebody who has voted for me in Edinburgh Central to keep the Tories out, because it is a two-horse race between the SNP and the Tories. that a vote of a Labour or a Liberal Democrat or a Green member who wants to keep the Tories out is necessarily a vote per se for independence. But what I'm very clear about is that a party in its manifesto saying that it is committed to, and its MSPs will vote for, a referendum taking place is a mandate for that choice. Now, we don't need to go around the houses again on this, but it would appear that the salient point here is being lost by some, that there is a difference between the right of self-determination and an agreed route as Democrats to be able to do that, with the pros and cons of independence itself. And still, nobody on the no side of the constitutional argument has been prepared to address this gap.
Can I say, Mr Robertson, this is an inquiry into a legal mechanism. We're taking evidence, and it's actually the whole point of these sorts of inquiries, and I mean, some may question whether there's a point to this inquiry, but the whole point of this inquiry is that we take evidence from experts and yourself. And I'm not suggesting you're not an expert or you don't have an insight onto it. That wasn't my intention. But the point is we're trying to take that information. So can I get back to the question that I asked? Is there a plan? Now, let's not call it a secret plan. Let's call it a plan at the moment the SNP want to keep secret. Is there a plan in how to deliver independence? Because the First Minister at your conference was quite clear. He said there is a precedent. When the SNP win a majority, there is a referendum. We will win a majority, and therefore there will be a referendum. So how is that going to be delivered? Is that simply rhetoric? Is there a detailed plan? Is that a legal path to a referendum? Can you give us more details on that? Because I think that is the salient point in relation to this inquiry.
As Mr Halcroft-Johnson, I'm sure, won't be surprised to learn that I'm a Democrat and the Scottish National Party is a democratic party that believes in the democratic process. So the plan is based on those principles. So we are standing for election to this Parliament, and if we are elected, we will pursue an independence referendum. Now, in any other country, in any other circumstance, that would not be considered to being a strange proposition that the party that wins with a manifesto commitment to do something actually does it. In fact, in most normal countries, opposition parliamentarians would be jumping up and down talking about delivering their manifesto commitments.
So the secret plan is to do what you've done before but haven't achieved.
We're straying into bits of this that are to do with the election to go going forward. Can we stick to the substantive report that we've done and the Cabinet Secretary's evidence?
I do think this is a question of Scottish Government and the party in the Scottish Government that has said not that they would push for another referendum, but there will be another referendum. Surely to deliver that, there has to be a legality to it. As Mr Robertson has quite rightly pointed out, it has to be a legal and acceptable referendum. The suggestion is, from what you're saying, there isn't a legal plan. It is the plan, the secret plan, the plan that's being kept secret, is simply to do what you've done before and hope. I would
never presume to describe the democratic process in the way that Mr Halcroft-Johnson has just done. I would have thought that as Democrats, again, all of us would be clamouring for the upholding of both domestic and international democratic standards, which is when the people elect a government to do something, they are empowered to get on and do it. But we're in a very strange and very... I'm very disappointed. I'm very disappointed by Mr Halcroft-Johnson.
There is no plan,
but perhaps for the record, it might be helpful to remind Mr Halcroft-Johnson, because we have, of course, stood against each other in elections before. And Mr Halcroft-Johnson was gracious enough to recognise the victory of the SNP in that contest. And in the same way, I'm appealing to him now. Having done so in a parliamentary context, should be doing so in a constitutional context as well.
The point I'm getting, I'm trying to extract from you is, and obviously it's frustrating Mr Brown, and I apologise if it... I apologise, but I mean, essentially the First Minister of Scotland has said there is a secret plan. Can we just be very, very clear? Oh, sorry, he said there is a plan. There is it was described as a former First Minister who obviously we've taken into account. It's quite clear there isn't anything different that you're offering here. There's no difference.
There is no other route to Scottish independence than the ballot box. And I'm committed to that, and I would hope Mr Halcrow-Johnson would be committed to that as well.
There's no secret plan.
Putting words in my mouth, Mr Halcrow-Johnson.
Well, yes or no, is there a secret? Is there a plan for independence?
There is a plan to secure Scottish independence, and it is through the ballot box.
So nothing does. Okay, that's...
I'm just very conscious of time. I have got two other members waiting to come in, and we do have another agenda item. So can I ask everybody to be concise in their questions and answers? Thank you, Mr Halcrow-Johnson.
Okay, well, I'll finish it, because that's really all I want to establish. And it seems to have amused SNP colleagues around this table. But I think those who voted or who will be watching it, who are very passionate nationalists, and I don't understand why they're passionate nationalists, but I understand their passion in their country, will be looking at this today and being slightly concerned that, having been told that there was some sort of great strategy, some sort of plan by the Scottish Government, by the SNP, sorry, there isn't one. And I think you've confirmed that, so I'll just leave it at that.
So, I'm sorry, words have been put in my mouth by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, and I'm sorry, that's just not acceptable. What I have stated... Convener, with your permission, am I in a position to answer the question?
No, you're clearly not. I mean,
right.
Otherwise, we would have had an answer at some point.
So, no,
it's serious.
I'm sorry, but this is a serious issue on a serious report that we've done a considerable amount of work on. Cabinet Secretary, I think your views have been made clear on the record, and I know you're concern about being misrepresented, but I think we have to move on and let other members have a chance to come in. So, Mr Harvey.
Thank you, Convener. I don't know if anybody started the Christmas sherry a bit early or something, but the high spirits seem to be kicking in a wee bit. Look, let's be realistic. This inquiry very clearly is going to elicit very different attitudes and views from those of us who want to see a referendum and those who don't. Those of us who want to see independence and those who don't. There's no kind of particular reason why we should pretend to be surprised about that dynamic on the committee. From my point of view, and I suspect from yours, the position that Scotland is being told that we have the right, the people of Scotland have the right to make a decision, but they may not exercise that right, is a fundamental contradiction. And it's as though the electoral authorities were telling you as an individual citizen, yes, of course you can register to vote, but we're not going to print any ballot papers or open any polling stations. So you have the right to vote, but you may not exercise that right. And the contradictions go deeper than that. We've heard from Mr Kerr that all we have to do is persuade the majority of people in Scotland to vote for something. That's all we're asking to have the opportunity to do. He seems to think that should happen through an election. And Mr Halcrow-Johnson tells us that an election, reminds us in fact, that an election is determined on a great many other issues, and that positions on independence are not necessarily the only thing. So either an election is the mandate for independence, or it's a mandate for a referendum. And it seems to me that we have to be clear that the latter is the case, that the mandate for a referendum is an election. But there's a contradiction as well creeping in the Scottish Government's position that I want to give you the opportunity to clarify. Because you've talked about the party that wins an election has the right to implement its promise. Right at the beginning of the meeting, you used the phrase, when parties win elections on a manifesto promise. I mean, that happened in 2007. Your party won the 2007 election. But it didn't have, even as a pro-independence party, it didn't have a majority in Parliament for that. and so there was no mandate for it in Parliament. More recently, there's been talk about whether a single-party majority is the necessary precondition, simply because that happened to be the case in 2011. But then repeatedly through today's meeting, you've also used phrases like when a majority of parliamentarians were elected on a commitment. You've referred to the current parliamentary majority in favour of a referendum, which is not a single-party majority in favour of a referendum. It's a parliamentary majority in favour of an independence referendum. So can you just be clear and explicit that the Scottish Government's position is that it's a majority in Parliament, not a single-party majority, that demonstrates the mandate to hold an independence referendum?
Well, that is certainly the case, and a majority in this Parliament have voted for there to be a referendum. And that counts for something. It should count for all Democrats and shouldn't be denied by any Democrats. I don't think votes for the Scottish Green Party, a party that has a manifesto commitment to hold a referendum, is worth anything less than a vote for the Scottish National Party or for any other party when it comes to matters in the Scottish Parliament. And that's why I believe that if the Scottish Parliament votes for something, that is what should happen. Now, in one area where I agree with Mr Kerr and Mr Halcrow-Johnson, this is a deeply political question. But it is only as capital P political because those parties that oppose independence have departed from the principled position that they used to have. Their parties used to have a principled position on self-determination in Scotland, and now, because they'd rather not have a referendum at all, they're dancing around a number of rhetorical approaches to suggest that not now, at some distant point in the future, with some imagined but not elucidated different level of mandate. You know, the inference is that 50% isn't enough from a party that had a Brexit referendum in the 30s, incidentally, that hasn't won a national election in Scotland since the 1950s. So to be lectured on democratic processes is really a bit rich. But, I mean, to Mr Harvey's point, I agree with the principle that if the majority of parliamentarians in this Parliament wish there to be a referendum, that is what should happen. I simply make the point, no doubt, given the politics of the circumstances, to be able to exactly match the circumstances of 2011 as a precedent may well be stronger. But that does not discount as a Democrat, because I think this is actually a question around principles. And the principle for me as a parliamentarian and a believer in parliamentary democracy is if a majority in the Parliament wish something to be so and they were elected with a manifesto to do so, that is what should happen.
I'm grateful for the clarity. I was perhaps expecting a little bit more of a pushback. And obviously we will separately get into what the political parties want out of the election process. That's not for this committee. Obviously every political party will want as many seats in Parliament as they can win. But I hope that when the Cabinet Secretary speaks with the other former member of the Smith Commission, who I'm sure he speaks to regularly, the First Minister, he'll reinforce the danger of implying to the people of Scotland and to the other political parties that if a pro-independence majority is returned in May, but not a single-party majority, we have to avoid the situation where other political parties or the UK government claim that the mandate being sought hasn't been achieved. And I hope that the Cabinet Secretary will encourage the First Minister to be equally explicit that the mandate being sought is a pro-independence majority of MSPs in Parliament.
No, I understand the point that Mr Harvey's making, but it's also a point for other political parties as well, this question. It's not just for the political parties that are in favour of having a referendum, who may or may not be in favour of independence. Helpfully, very recently, the Welsh Government published a report on these matters, on the constitutional future of Wales in the United Kingdom. And they said, and I quote, "It must be open to any of its parts democratically to choose to withdraw from the Union. If this were not so, a nation could conceivably be bound into the UK against its will, a situation both undemocratic and inconsistent with the idea of a union based on shared values and interests." So, I am simply appealing for colleagues, and we disagree on the substance of whether we would vote yes or no, but as Democrats to agree that through the ballot box, in democratic election, to this Parliament, we should be able to determine a vote on the country's future. It's not that complicated. It's pretty basic in terms of democratic values and has the beauty of a precedent. It's happened before. So it can and it will happen again.
Through a majority in Parliament?
Through a vote by parliamentarians.
Thank you.
Mr Adam.
Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I think we're seeing the cold, hard fear and desperation of the Unionists here today as they desperately try and grasp for that last grasp of, you sound it. You know, the whole point is that if you look at this inquiry, you know, one man's flexible constitution is another man's closed shop. You know, and one of the things that I've actually seen from this is it not the case that the UK constitution is the problem, because I was going to say it's written in the back of a beer mat, but that would be something written, and it doesn't have anything in writing at all. So the whole idea is it's made up as it goes along. To use football parlance, they don't know what they're doing. They just continually just make things up as they go along with the situation. And is it not the case that the constitution is like a constitutional dinosaur compared to other countries like Canada, Germany, that have full federal kind of states and actually treat their devolved issues with their parliaments with actual respect? You know, is that not the key and the problem that we have here, Cabinet Secretary, is the lack of respect and the fact that there is no UK constitution, it's made up as they go along?
So I agree with Mr Adam, and he's absolutely right in general, although I would draw the committee's attention to it. I wouldn't be the first person in giving evidence to this committee on this question, that whilst it's not enshrined in a constitution, the right of self-determination for a constituent nation in this United Kingdom is written into legislation and is written into international treaties. And that is the route by which Northern Ireland is in a position to determine whether it should become part of a united Ireland or not. Not just the mechanism of how that might take place, but that it might take place every 7 years. Now, I've said before, Scotland's position is not exactly analogous with Northern Ireland, but the right of self-determination is an inalienable right. It's not held just in one place and not another. Either we believe in the right of self-determination, a family of nations, all valued, or not. And we have an inconsistency in that we have that as a de jure situation for Northern Ireland, and for England, by dint of its size, we have a de facto right of England to determine self-determination within the context of the United Kingdom because they constitute 85% of. Now, it is just not sustainable for it to remain so. Should there be a mechanism? Yes. Why? Because it happens elsewhere in this state. It happens in other comparable multinational states. It is not a difficult thing to do. We know because it's happened already. Ergo, there is precedent, so we know how it can happen. And all of us, and it's disappointing that colleagues on the other side of the constitutional argument are not prepared to step up, avow the principles that they say they adhere to in terms of democratic principles. Democracy is not a secret. It is in public, it involves a ballot box, it involves people voting, it involves people being elected to this Parliament, and for those who stand in the path of it, I'm sorry, are denying the democratic process and, by extension, the democratic right of people to exercise the right of self-determination. That is not sustainable.
And Cabinet Secretary, just finally, you bring up the important point, because there's much talk about the elections next year, but we have a scenario where there could be a nationalist government in Belfast, nationalist government in Scotland, a nationalist government in Wales, and only one of them only one, has the opportunity to be able to make a move forward. So surely when we look at that, that's the problem with the UK Constitution. Well, it's not flexible, it's a straitjacket.
So Mr Adam is again correct, and I have absolutely no doubt, especially after the opinion polls yesterday in Wales, confirming the leading position of Plaid Cymru, the appalling level of support for the Welsh Labour Party and indeed the Welsh Conservative Party. And when one looks at the polls in Northern Ireland, I think the prognosis that Mr Adam draws to our attention of the likely outcome of elections in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is that for the first time there will be heads of government in 3 of the 4 nations of this United Kingdom who believe in fundamental constitutional change. And I would wish there to be a mechanism agreed by all, But if not, I think, as never before, we will have a debate, and a debate in England as well, given that potential and likely outcome of the elections next year, again, that the status quo is not sustainable. And resting on an unwritten constitution and the fact that it is not written in stone as being a strength is actually a weakness, and one that undermines democratic rights in Scotland, and that is not sustainable.
Okay, thank you.
To draw it to close there, Cabinet Secretary, thank you to you and your officials for your attendance this morning at committee. I can ask for people to clear the room really quickly, because we do have another agenda item that I'm hoping we get through before we have to leave for the Chamber this morning. Thank you very much. I wish everyone a very good Christmas and New Year.